our second quarterly meeting for administrators who are responsible for special education. And we are, as we have done with the other meetings, we are recording this so that we can distribute it to all of you and anyone who has, that they were not able to be with us today. So I just want to start by saying thank you to everyone. This is my last quarterly special education meeting. I'm not counting days, but it is 9 days till I retire. So I do want to let you know how fortunate I feel to have been able to work with all of you, and it's really enriched my career and my life. So thank you very much, and I certainly wish everyone well as you continue on this wonderful journey. It's an exciting time, and I know all of you are going to do great things for students with disabilities and for all students. So with that being said, I'm happy to introduce Amy Alfrey from the Department of Education, and she is going to give us the DE updates.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. It feels so good to always come back here. It's like coming home. I said that last time too, and it just feels good to see familiar faces. So thanks for letting me be a part of your meeting. I have just a couple things to share with you. Most of them are items that we talked about the last time when we're moving statewide systems, thanks to moving slow, but continuing to move forward. And so the IEP IFSP system, we've got an update on that. We did, we had the RFI up the last time I think when I was here, the request for information, and there were 7 total responses from vendors on the request for information. And 5 of those moved forward with a statewide review team. And so what we did, and again, that request for information is just that, gathering information that might be useful enough for us in determining what we are asking for in a system. It was not to result in a bid with the vendor yet. And so we did have that internal team meet on November 29th, and from the 5 responses from vendors, we really didn't score them or anything. We really just looked at what are the things that were the things we really liked out of the features out of the systems that they could provide, what we liked, what was missing, and really we made a list of all of those features and have begun now the work on the request for proposal. Today at 3:30, the DE internal team is meeting to discuss whether that RFP that will be posted will include statewide data system for all. So to include IEP in a bigger statewide system, similar to the path we were on before, or if we will move forward with an RFP for a special education system that would absolutely still link up to another bigger statewide data system. So it'll just determine whether we have one RFP or 2 different ones. So that decision, or at least conversation around that decision, will happen today at 3:30. Any questions about that right now? We are continuing to use all of the data and information from the teams, the different stakeholder teams that met prior with the work with TIER, and we're using all of that input in this. We're not starting over. I just want to say that. Like we know there's been a lot of work already done on this, but we learned some lessons along that way too, and so we're using all that information and moving forward. We are still really hopeful that by the end of January, we could have an RFP posted. So keep fingers crossed, and I'll keep you posted on that. Okay, then the graduation, it says graduation memo because I was really hoping to share with you today the official memo from the DE regarding the amendments to Chapter 41. However, Barb Guy has been very ill, and so she's been out for some time. She's back in the office this week, and so she and Tom are working on that, and I'm hopeful that we can get that released in the next few weeks. But the state board did give notice to that everyone knew was coming, but to amend Chapter 41, and I've linked it there on this document. So you can review the exact language in there regarding graduation requirements. And it is right now, I can't say too much more about it other than you can read the amendment there, or the proposed amended language. And it is up for written comment right now through January 8th, and those go directly to Thomas. And then the official memo that is coming out really soon, and it will go to AEA directors to be then dispersed. I think that's the process. But that will explain a lot more about like what that means and what the implications are. But the other thing that's happening, and Larry was a part of this team, there's a kind of stakeholder team, a work team that is meeting, steering committee, I guess is what you would call it, to think about what are the supports that districts will need in order to meet these requirements, and to look at the timelines, and to look at some of the policies and the language in those. And so that team met on November 27th for the first time, and then now Barb and Kim are doing some follow-up work, and there'll be some information coming out about that. But Kim Kirshner, I included her contact information. She's the lead on that team right now. So if you want to be a part of that, or if you have thoughts around that, I know it's kind of vague until you see the memo, but once you see that memo, if you want to make any comments to Kim, her contact information is there. Okay, and so I think the one thing I want to make sure to dispel around Chapter 41 is one of the big questions we've had is, so students on alternate assessment will not receive a diploma, and that's just completely false. That's not accurate, and so we just want to dispel that, and you'll get more information as you look at the language and as you see the memo from the DE and the resources and tools that are being developed around that. But that does not mean those do not equate with each other. Okay, so anything you're hearing about that, please squash that and watch for the information coming. Okay, and then the last thing on there is the Iowa SDI and SPDIG update. And I just wanted to let you know that now the overview modules are available on AEA Learning Online, and I have a link there. And you just search in the course catalog for specially designed instruction. If you want to use those with any staff members or take a look at them, they are just self-paced modules. There is one that's an overview of SDI, and then one for each diagnose, design, and deliver. They are not intended to be deep learning around the SDI framework. They are intended to be overview information, to give kind of some common foundational language around the work we're doing with those. So if you want, you can preview those modules, you can use them. They're free on AEA Learning Online, and available for you to use in any way you want to. If you have questions around those, or if you're or have concerns about any of the content in those, feel free to send that my way. Okay, because again, still in usability, still trying some things out. We did have modules last year that we tried out a little bit based on the usability site feedback. We made significant adjustments to those, and so these are the revised modules. So if you looked at them last year, these are different. So take a look if you want to at those and use them as you will. And then the other link, there's two other links there, and Mary has shared both of these with you guys before, but I also put them here since it's fitting. One is the SDI overview, and that document just tells you across AEAs and across districts who's in usability sites, who are we engaging with right now in the SDI work, and so that's just for your use. And then the other link there is the current SDI framework, and I wanted to make sure that everyone's using. There's been a couple reiterations along the way, and that is the actual, the current version. And so if you have any other versions, make sure that they match this one, or delete those and use this one. There's definitely some language changes in there. And that's all based on the work that we've been doing with our usability site. And I know Mary shared that. It's the same one, I think, Mary, that you shared the last time, but I just wanted to be sure that it's linked there. So that's there for you. Then the other thing that, these are just resources that are available on the department's website, but as everyone knows right now, Chapter 103, hot topic, a lot of media and a lot of news and a lot of state complaints and things like that around that right now. So I just wanted to share those top 10 points to remember around Chapter 103, and then also those Chapter 103 administrative rules with you as a resource and as for something for you to think about as you continue supporting your staff with appropriate restraint and seclusion. Two things that I'll be bringing to you for sure by this time is a deeper overview and some of the information around the data elements for IDEA differentiated accountability, or IDEA PA. And so a lot of those data elements are being refined right now, and we should be able to share that with you by your next quarterly meeting. And to have you have a beginning of an understanding of what the support levels will look like for districts as we begin differentiated accountability for IDEA. And then also coming is something that right now is called ISER, I-S-E-R, but we plan to change the name. That's just the name the vendor assigned. But what that is a web-based application that has all of the legal resources that we might want to use, like the special education legal codes, policy information, civil rights information. It's a searchable web-based, so it's like, you know, the orange Bible that we all use and have dog-eared and sticky noted to death. Well, this system is going to be able to help you like look up cases, look up code, get information around all of those kinds of legal matters. And so, yeah, it's going to be, and we're working on the user guide right now for it, and then we'll be sending that out statewide. That'll be a helpful resource, I think, for administrators. Okay, that's all that I have right now to share, unless there's other questions or wonderings, things that I can take back or answer here. Happy to do that.
So Amy, today you're meeting to talk about the statewide system of IFSP, IEP, and potentially the whole system.
Correct.
And so a decision will be made today whether it's going to be integrated or a separate system.
And I can't guarantee a decision will be made today.
Okay.
For sure, a conversation is happening today at 3:30 based on the synthesized information from our RFI process and where we are in moving forward with an RFP for a data management system for the state.
Okay.
And that was on their agenda already, but we want to make sure we consider whether special ed, if that can be timely enough.
Yeah.
Right. That's the critical thing. We have a system that is time limited on its sustainability right now. Our IEP and IFSP system, intentionally so, because we had a plan, right, for a new system. The updates and things have not been put into the current IEP system to make it sustainable. And so right now, we have to look at the timeline to see if we need to move forward with an RFP for a special ed system, or if we can do the whole statewide data system at the same time. And that's the conversation that's happening today at 3:30. Regardless of, I mean, there's no option not to move forward with an RFP, at least for special ed data. That's going to happen no matter what, but it's whether we combine and do an RFP for the whole system, similar to what we were doing with Iowa Tier, or if we move forward just special ed first. But even if we do, no matter what, a non-negotiable for a potential vendor would be that it must have the capability to interface and intertwine and link with a management system. That's our whole goal in upgrading this system. Okay.
One other comment about the 103B.
Sure.
Rod is going to go into a little bit more detail about the specific things for districts to watch out for a little later in the agenda today. So thanks. So the next agenda item, Amy Knupp, the Executive Director of Special Education, is going to review the AW case and the implications for all of us. Just want to let you know that as part of the recording today, this will be separated out, and there will be a separate recording just talking about the AW case that can be disseminated to the AEA staff and the LEA staff, separate from the full meeting today. So I'll turn it over to Amy.
Well, I just want to start with one little thing, and that is I'm in denial that Mary Ellen has 9 days left. So I'm ignoring it. So if you congratulate her, make sure my back's turned or I'm so misleading. We wanted to review the AW case today with you because I know there's been a lot of chit chat about it and talk about it, and I know that our AEA staff have gotten a little nervous about what these implications mean. So a due process was held in October of 2016, and we got the results in the spring of 2017. This due process was in Hartland. And so Randy Allison has been very instrumental in helping us put together a PowerPoint to share with everyone. So we're not fully certain of what the total impact will be because it's currently under appeal. And so we don't know how long that will take and what that will entail. We do know that many students have educational concerns, but not all students need special education. So we want to make sure that we're helping students and helping parents to understand our process, and also identifying the kids that we know need special ed services. The facts transpired over several years. They did have numerous supports for staff, including some legal advice that came into them. I think there were 3 or 4 different times this child was evaluated for special ed services. So it wasn't that they were ignoring her or not doing what they needed to do. There were many times this child was considered. We can always say hindsight's better. It's always 20/20 when we're looking in the rearview mirror. You know, it always manages to show us what we missed or what we should have known. But this case does provide us a time to reflect, a time to look at our practices, and a time to determine if we need to change and how we can improve our practices. The issues in the case, first of all, whether the eligibility criteria and procedures utilized by the respondents, by Heartland, illegally restricted the scope of federal entitlement to special education. So there was what they felt was an ignoring of a long-term pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So were we looking at what the child's strengths were, and were we only focusing on the weaknesses? The long-term concerns, you know, over time, they didn't feel like they were looking at those. The outside medical diagnosis, they didn't feel like the team took that into consideration. The outside medical diagnosis was taken into consideration. And the capacity of Gen Ed to fulfill what made the SDI, the specially designed instruction, needs. So where does Gen Ed stop and specially designed instruction start? So we had narrowed kind of the definition, or they had narrowed the definition of what that was, or we need to narrow the definition of what that is so that we understand fully when it is Gen Ed and when it turns into specially designed instruction. And whether the respondents violated the procedural requirements violated the procedural requirements of IDEA by allowing the eligibility determination to be made by the AEA. The team, the IEP team, determines the eligibility for a student. We don't swoop in and do the evaluation and make that determination. We take all the data, we have our professional recommendation, we take all the data in, and then the team comes to a decision on whether that child is eligible and what services are needed for that child to meet FAPE, to get FAPE. And whether the respondents violated the child find requirement by failing to identify the students. Remember, there were 3 or 4 different evaluations, and each time the child was not found eligible. So did that violate FAPE for this child? This is a judge quote. This case presents issues of broad public importance concerning the process used to identify children with specific learning disabilities and determine their eligibility for special ed and services under the IDEA. So are we following processes that are needed in order to determine the qualification for a child? Are we following our set processes and the processes? One of the things that they looked at was a severe discrepancy. And the other thing, I just lost it. The other thing was
The
capacity of gen ed. So those are basically the two things that we were looking at, or they were looking at, and found that maybe weren't quite, that we had denied faith to this child. So the basic chronology is the student came into the district in 4th grade, and this student had previously been on CPI, or Competent Private Instruction, homeschool. So the child enters school. And of course, that immediately brings up the question of exclusionary factors. What kind of instruction did the child get over time? You know, where was the child at? How was the child performing? Those sorts of things. This child had had numerous interventions in reading and math over the years, and each time they set an intervention in place, the child made good progress. So the intensity varied, of course, but there was good implementation. The student always responded. There were 3 outside agency evaluations and reports that all indicated the child had learning problems, learning disabilities, and a medical diagnosis of dyslexia. So that was all in the outside reports. The child did have tutoring from an outside agency, and the tutoring was in Barton Reading. We are unclear on the frequency or the intensity or how well this was done over the course of that tutoring. And 3 AEA evaluations, which never determined eligibility. The child was always making progress. Child was never significantly discrepant from the others, and they never really considered specially designed instruction. It was all provided in gen ed. The problems the judge found was that we should not be determining a disability on the basis of a significant discrepancy. That kind of blew some of us out of the water because we think of a significant discrepancy as being part of our evaluation process, but that we were not to look at that between what the child does and peers, or what the child does and the standards. So the significance or severe discrepancy was one of the problems the judge found. The other one was the instruction was within the capacity of gen ed. We cannot base a determination of specially designed of special ed based on what gen ed can do. We have to look at the services a child needs, what constitutes faith, where does SDI come in, and all the things together, not just a discrepancy and if it can be handled in gen ed. And the findings, the costs, they were entitled to a reimbursement of the out-of-pocket expense to provide a tutor and the Barton Reading between May of 2014 and August of 2016. And that was payable by the State Department of Ed, and they were entitled to attorney fees, which was also to be payable by the State Department of Education. This currently is under appeal by the State Department of Education, and it's challenging because it really placed the LEA and the AEA kind of on opposite sides of the Department of Ed. So it's hard to collaborate and to determine what they can do, what we should do in this case, because we're kind of on opposite sides. And so they have written the appeal, and we will see what happens next down the line. But we have made some decisions or some, I guess, some result that we want to take action on throughout this. So, sorry, backwards. Okay. The issues and findings, the patterns of strengths and weaknesses were not found to be a denial of faith, and neither was the clinical diagnosis, because they felt the team had taken that into consideration. Okay. The two that was failing to make an individual determination instead of using the significant discrepancy, and narrowing the definition of special ed by requiring that it had to be over and above what could be sustained in gen ed. And the way that I think about this is the severe discrepancy could be different school to school, district to district. I could have a severe discrepancy in school A and go to school B, and I could be right on target. So is that really telling us if there's a disability or not? And capacity of gen ed can also be different from school to school. Because I'm assuming in Waterloo, the capacity to gen ed is a little bit higher than in a North Tama or wherever, a smaller school district. So the capacity can look different also. So we have to take all that into consideration. And whether the respondents violated procedural requirements, that was a no. They did follow procedures. And whether the respondents violated child fine, that's a yes and no, because we used the significant discrepancy model in order to make a determination. Was this child really needing special ed services? Here is a notice of the appeal that was the department has filed. They want to really note a declaration that its rules are compliant with IDEA. And they recently received, correct me if I'm wrong, but a letter from OSEP regarding the procedures and policies that we follow, or that they follow, and were found to be compliant with federal rules and regs. So. Did I miss some slides?
You missed just one.
Did I?
The one
Yeah,
about,
Oh, I know. Sorry.
that one.
This one. Okay. I thought I did. This current status is the evaluation standards, evaluation eligibility standards, our state procedures manual and Chapter 41 rules do not always align. And at this time, we use the information provided in the December 2015 evaluation and eligibility standards, because our 2000 later than that has the significant discrepancy. As of December 1st, the significant discrepancy was dropped off of our EER. So we will no longer be looking at that to make decisions. And now in the last box on the EER, where it talks about the determination, we will put a statement in there that says the evaluation IEP team will meet to review the full and individual evaluation results and make an eligibility determination. Then that determination will be made at the meeting. Oftentimes, I think staff were putting that in there in order to send out before, so parents had an idea of what the findings had shown, what the results had shown. So we want to make sure that, sorry about that, Heather, I walked right over it, didn't I? So where am I looking ahead? Currently, we're in stay put until the ALJ's ruling, according to the ALJ's ruling. Changes may not be over. You know, we've got to wait and see what happens down the line. And changes will impact us on many levels. we're looking more at our evaluation as a way to determine what each child needs. Instead of looking at a discrepancy model and where are they at with peers and is this capacity, can it be fulfilled in gen ed versus going to special ed? We want to dig down deeper and find out what the real problem is and make this more a student progressing through the gen ed as they need to, and what supports do they need in place in order to be able to do that. So it's not going to be a numbers game or a discrepancy game. It's going to be more so digging down to find what each child, where the holes are and how do we fill those holes or gaps are. We'll need to understand evaluation reports are different, and we want people, parents especially, if they feel like they have a medical diagnosis of dyslexia or anything else, and they're bringing that in, we have to give due consideration to that. I think sometimes with the dyslexia, there's been a lot of reports coming in, and people kind of groan a little bit or say, well, your child scores too high in order to, even if they do have dyslexia, in order to qualify, they score too high. We have to completely get away from saying that. Completely. We do not use cutoff scores. We need to be saying, okay, we'll do the disability suspect and see where we fall and talk the parent through that. Your disability, suspicion of disability will take you through each one of those questions and lead you to determination if you need to evaluate or not. So always use the suspicion of disability. Do not use they score too high or cutoff score. You're above the 10th or 12th percentile. And then we're working on an integrated aligned professional. Oh, I'm sorry, Mary. Yep.
How because the suspected disability is still even though it's been around for many years, it's still delayed, or kind of said, well, we're busy, or they kind of put a pecking order. I don't really know how to say it. How is that message going to get to buildings and teams to understand that it's, it needs to be, because we know once, if you do suspect a disability and we sign for evaluation, we got the 60 days.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm hearing is that conversation about disability suspect and then the time frame to get to that completion of it.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we may understand the 60-day timeline, but we extend that disability suspect timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that message going to continue to get to teams on the importance of this needs to be done in a time frame that does not delay the process?
All of our staff will be hearing about this case and walking through the same PowerPoint next week. So they are going to be aware of that. One of the things that I want to caution you on or clarify is that, yes, we want to use the disability suspect, but mostly that's a conversation with parents so they're being heard. I know it's a low bar and we could have a lot of them coming in, but I think that conversation, really sitting down with the parent and talking to the parent through the whole process and have them understand the process. If it goes to disability suspect, then yes, the team's going to have to complete that evaluation. But they will all be hearing about this next week. So they should have a clear understanding of what the requirements are.
I think that's one of the reasons why we want to be so careful about this ruling this is really an opportunity to improve our practices. Because we did focus for a while on significant discrepancy and that outside the capacity. And so it really was that our evaluation procedures were too restrictive in some ways. So we want to use this opportunity to improve our practices to demonstrate that we are in compliance with the state and federal regulations. So that it probably will come down the pike as far as methodology, at least that we have demonstrated that we are employing appropriate evaluation procedures.
I think you just went through this next one then. So like I said, use the available suspicion standards, and that's what we're going to tell staff. Always inquire about outside evaluation, and if there are any, and get a release signed. When you start signing for evaluation, you need to get a release signed, and inform parents at the point of where they consent to an evaluation, what that will look like down the road and when they can expect at the staffing for what's going on. So give them a clear picture so they understand it's, 60-day timeline, all that kind of stuff. Make sure that they understand. And the do's for during an evaluation, we need to focus on what has been offered and received historically. So going back to these 3 evaluations to determine what had happened over the course of time. We need to holistically consider strengths and weaknesses. And over time also, what is it that the child can currently do? Not what they can't do, but what can they do? And how can that help us to move them forward in the intervention process? Focus on the analysis, synthesis, and understanding of why the deficits are occurring. We don't just want a number. We want to know where the deficits are and what will help to reduce those deficits. So getting down to the nitty-gritty of what is going to work for this child. We need to consider all the sources of information and justify why the differences occur, maybe in the information, because sometimes there will be reports that come in from outside that don't look exactly like what we're finding. So why would that be? And then determine if we need SDI for overcoming these deficits. Okay. Focus on what's been, whoops, I think I got a double. Oh no. We want to focus on what's been provided and the impact of that. What has the child done? This makes it kind of tough in this case because the child always made progress, as they set interventions in place. There were a lot of interventions in place at the school for this child. I think the child was meeting with the principal one-on-one, the counselor one-on-one. There was just a lot of things going on in the school for this child. And that isn't going to happen in every school, So we've got to think about what does this child need, and can those needs meet the definition of SDI, and how can we provide that? We want to focus on the educational and instructional ramifications, the implications of the discrepancy, but the discrepancy is not going to make our determination. Okay? And if they're not meeting expectations, why is that, and what do we need to fix it? It's not just about, I go back to the IQ achievement tests and just finding a difference there. That didn't tell us what we needed to do for a child to help them. So that's what we want to start looking at, is what do we need to do for the child? We don't want to ignore outside evaluations or reports, and we don't want to focus on numerical discrepancies. Okay? We don't want to fail to consider the use of SDI in Gen Ed without consideration of a suspicion. When does GEI become SDI? And that's what we're kind of working on right now, is what does that look like? And we do not want to discuss the capacity of Gen Ed in considering the student needs. Okay.
They didn't ignore the reports, did they? They just didn't give it enough.
I don't think that they ignored the reports. It's like I said, sometimes we kind of send off this, oh, okay, type of attitude, and it's not really giving the due, I don't want to say process, but the due respect to an outside evaluation.
It's because we get so many of them.
I know. And I think that kind of lessens our intensity. Mm-hmm. And that lessens our intensity of, do they matter? I know that sometimes reports come in from outside places that people say, well, they're not telling me anything we don't know. And so you kind of, but we need to really make parents understand that we are looking at that, and if there's differences in what that report's saying to what we're thinking, you need to explain why. Why are those differences occurring?
I think that kind of the last 2 bullets of when does GEI become SDI, and what is the capacity of general ed? Having that discussion of how long is an intervention in place before we say, this is, I guess we're kind of stop using the word capacity. I know we're supposed to kind of do that, but, trying to figure out, okay, well, this is specially designed instruction. This is for this individual, not a group of kids. So that's going to be continued conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I know I'll have talks with Jane, because I think some of our middle school conversations is talking about this a little bit of, okay, well, if we're saying that's what they need, are they really general ed anymore, or do we need to look at suspected disability?
But they were making progress on their interventions, correct? And they weren't stagnant.
No.
What's the implication with MTSS now then?
I think it was more so the amount of resources that were being put into this child in that particular district. We have to look at, also what is reasonable and what can be replicated elsewhere. And I think this district was putting, like, the principal meeting one-on-one with the child, the counselor meeting one-on-one with the child, things like that were going on, that moving to another school, are those things going to be able to be sustained and in place? So you're kind of looking at those sorts of things. So I don't know that it has a real impact on MTSS. I think it's more of what are we providing this child that could be constant across, if they moved across districts and across time.
I think one thing that I've heard through this discussion is that if you're doing those things and you're considering them general ed, you can just stop. But if you're doing those things in the specially designed instruction, there's a whole set of parental rights and procedures that go with that. So I think that's a piece that at least I see in this of, the protection from the family, that, if you're providing these, you can't just stop.
Right.
So I think that's a piece that I take from it.
Continued ongoing support.
In mind.
One of the things I think is interesting in this case, in the 3 evaluations that were conducted, the first one and the third one, the judge agreed with the decision that the child was not eligible based at that point in time. But the middle one, the child should have been eligible, and the judge's ruling was the procedures at that point were too restrictive. And so it is kind of an interesting case, because the procedures were followed, and in one situation it was ruled that it wasn't appropriate. In 2 other situations it was ruled that it was appropriate. The other, to your question about the outside evals, that was one of the issues that the parents presented, that they felt that the school team had not considered, but that was not founded. That the parents did not prevail on that. The judge ruled that the team had considered it. What we're saying here is we just want to make sure that it's very explicit to parents that the school team, that they're considering any outside reports, because it wasn't clear to these parents. And so just some interesting points.
Moving forward. We're going to continue to monitor the situation and provide multiple levels of support and multiple learning opportunities. The state directors, we're going to continue to discuss the issue and provide direction on where we want to go. We don't know how long the appeal process will take. We have to let it run its course. We're going to continue to provide the best services we can. It's what we do. And we'll use the analysis of the ALJ to make positive and proactive adjustments to our evaluative approach. We've already taken out the discrepancy boxes so that they're not there. We changed the last question. Your attention to the needs of students and willingness to make the changes is greatly appreciated. So we'll continue to work on this, continue to answer questions, and work with our staff to ensure that we're meeting the needs of students.
one thing I think might be helpful is to identify, because it is important to get all this information out to our staff, but also to the LEA administrators and the superintendent. So if there are some ideas that you have, like Larry, you brought that up, as how is this going to get out? What would be a good avenue for superintendents, building administrators, and other LEA staff? You have some ideas.
I think it's important for time to do that actual PowerPoint.
Okay.
I believe that that's critical. Because we don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I don't. So I'm
Okay.
glad that I'm here today. But I would talk with Sam, and it would be worthy of 15, 20 minutes on the next.
Okay, thank you. How about
Could you please repeat
We can't hear.
Repeat my comment.
Jane Lindeman is here, and the superintendent for Waterloo, and said that she felt that we needed to do a do this PowerPoint for the superintendent attendance at the next superintendent meeting, which is in January, I think January 3rd,
I don't know if we push it back a week, but
9th, January 9th.
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Yep. Any other questions, comments?
I wonder if it would be worth then sending out the recorded version with a copy of the PowerPoint to the building administrators.
Okay,
And you might even pose that to the superintendents on how they're going to get it to their administrators and make sure, because every district based on size is going to have their own structure.
the comment was that we need to send this out to the building administrators and ask the superintendents at the next meeting how they're going to ensure that the building administrators have the PowerPoint. Any other ideas? Yeah.
Comment maybe, I think everybody was really hopeful that this would really help that GEI, special diet, where's that threshold, when's it crossed? So I guess that part of it was a little disappointing that we didn't get more clear guidance on that, but maybe
That may, I think that's
Fuzzy.
part,
Fuzzier.
but I do think it's part of the appeal.
Yeah.
That the DE, and so the Department of Ed is hoping that the administrative law judge would provide more clarity on that for us. So that may come. One of the things I wonder about are parents. And I know some of the parent advocacy groups are interested in communicating with parents, because there's been some miscommunication out in the field as far as what the implications are from this case. And so I wonder if it wouldn't be worthwhile to communicate formally with parent groups. Sue, I'm looking at you.
that's a great idea.
To communicate what the field is doing to address the concerns.
I think you could even maybe blend in some of the methodology concerns to that group as well.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I think, Rod, you're up.
Yeah, I'm gonna move ahead and talk about 103B. Like Amy had talked about sooner, there has been, due to some things that we've seen in the papers the last few months in regards to the state training school in Eldora, 103B has also come to question. Obviously, Eldora's case is different. 103B is written to give guidance to schools. What we've seen at Eldora is something different through a correctional facility rule, but it has once again brought up. So it's really good to kind of highlight on 103B. 103B has been around since November 12, 2008. So it's going on year 10. Hasn't changed, but it's always good to highlight a little bit of what it's about and what we really need to pay attention to in regards to it. And that's kind of what I'm going to do today. First off, when 103B came out, it really stated that there needed to be a training requirement. Very important. And what is that training requirement? Well, number one, if you have staff that are, now I think it's important before I start, 103B is just not a special ed law. It's all students. But if you have staff that are going to get themselves in a position where they may need to use restraint, physical restraint, or they may need to use de-escalation or timeout intervention procedures, they need to be trained. And what is that training? Number one is de-escalation and restraint training, which in this AEA, we now have CPI as our main training model, crisis prevention intervention. And if you have a group of teachers and ed assistants, as an example, or a crisis team in your building, those people should be trained in some type. If it's not crisis prevention intervention, the other big one has always been MANT. Although there's not as much of the MANT going around as it once was, crisis prevention intervention has become kind of the major training component because it's a shorter training and it does provide good guidance. So you should have your staff trained in crisis prevention intervention. That does have a renewal process as part of it. So if they continue to be part of that, they will get that renewal process. The other component that we often forget about is actual training on 103B itself as a law. And really, it's on, we have a link on our special ed site on, do you want to put that in, Heather? On our special ed site that takes you to the state online PD process. And it's mandatory training in that. And I always get asked a lot, who should take that? And I kind of view it the same as bloodborne pathogens. Everybody in your building should be exposed to that 103B training yearly. It kind, you know, and as you see on a link I have, we have you got that up, Amy? Heather, on how to get to that. And you have to register to get on this online training site by the state. But once you register, it's in there. It's a webinar that covers the law. So that should be a yearly process and my recommendation for all staff.
Is there a cost to that?
This is free. We used to have it, we had our own webinar on this as an AA, but now that there is a state one, we just have gone to using the state one. It's consistent, it's used across the state. So the training component is very important. As we move into the law itself, it's important to understand that reasonable force can be used. And I'm not going to go through the whole law by any means. And that the other big one was the use of material restraints. You cannot use material restraints or prone restraints. What's a material restraint? You can't duct tape a kid to a chair. Plain and simple. You read about that occasionally. You can't use it. A big one that I had encountered years ago was, and this is really was kind of standard practice for a long time. You had preschool kids in Ripton chairs with seat belts. Seat belts considered a physical restraint. So we had to deal with that and change some mindsets in teachers. So that's what a mechanical restraint is. It's not a therapeutic or a medical device that's been designed or prescribed. It's not a harness on a bus. So that's important to know. Also important to understand, no employee is forbidden from using reasonable physical force to protect themselves, the student, other students, or property.
Does reasonable include restraint?
If you're trained to use CPI or that methodology, that would be reasonable. I would make sure people are trained, Larry. I'll give a definition. What is reasonable force? Reasonable physical force, privileged at its inception, does not lose its privileged status by reasons of an injury to a student not reasonably foreseeable or otherwise caused by intervening acts of another, including the student. So, you know, we know that if you're having to deal with a student who's being physically aggressive, there could be some intensity there. But as long as you're using reasonable force and you're trained, that's the important concept here. Reasonable force is determined on 5 factors: size, physical, mental, and psychological condition of the student, nature of the behavior or misconduct, instrumentality used to apply force, extent of injury to the student, if any, and employee's motivation in using force. And I think the last one's really important. You know, you can't go in with a punishment mentality. This is to protect student, other students, equipment. Now, when we talk about seclusion and restraint, one of the big one is what is seclusion? Okay. It is not the use of a timeout room or other enclosure in which the student's egress is not restricted. So what I mean by that is you have a recovery room as part of your behavior plan, where if a student's getting a little edgy, they can go kind of, you know, get themselves in control, but they can come back at free will. That would not be what would be seclusion in the law. What is seclusion? You're putting a kid in an intervention room. You're not allowing them out. You're using one of the power door locks to keep them in. That would be seclusion. Restraint is pretty simple. Restraint is when you're using any physical type of moves to prevent the kid from hurting themselves. There's a rule on both using seclusion and restraint. If seclusion goes or restraint goes beyond 60 minutes, you need an administrator to give you approval to go on beyond that. Never use a door lock with a key or a manual lock on a door. Really, if you're going to have a door lock mechanism on your intervention rooms, it needs to be one of the power plunger locks in which somebody needs to be there to operate and oversee that. Whenever you're using seclusion with a student, you have to have an adult supervise. Now, I always get, it seems like every year, 10 calls on what's adequate size for a seclusion room, intervention room. And I'm just going to give you kind of my experience on this. I just got a call from a district just a couple months ago, and it wasn't even in this AEA. And the student could, the room they currently use, the student could put his arms over his head and his feet, and he could climb up the wall. So I always tell people, make sure the room's 2 feet taller than the student or the students that you potentially could put into that. So, you know, figure if you're talking a middle school room, middle school kids, I was just at a wrestling meet in South Tama this weekend where my son was at on Friday night, and there were 8th graders there that were 6'2". So, you know, you probably need a room 8 by 8. Another advice I would give is drop ceilings. Remember the Breakfast Club? You know, gets up in the rafters. I had this, if you're using drop ceiling tiles, you know, in the room, make sure you've got enough height that the student can't get at. If they can get at that, you probably want to put in, this particular school is then going to take that drop ceiling out and put in a permanent wall structure. So you got to think of safety for and the size, and then there needs to be good ventilation in that room. So those are just things to keep in mind. I always get asked that question in regards to that. The big one with 103B when it came out is it required the use of parent notification. And this is the big one I really want to encourage, I really want to stress today. That is something that can easily be forgotten to do. You need to make sure if a student is put into seclusion where egress is not allowed, or if they're physically restrained, there needs to be parent notification. What does that parent notification look like? There should be some factors in that. You need to have, this is the documentation contents, and I probably will get something out in writing as a whole AA document, or we'll put something in on the website in regards to this. Because it is a form that the district can develop themselves, but the documentation content should be name of the student involved, obviously, name of the employees involved, including the administrator offering any additional period of confinement or restraint, date, time, and duration, accurate record of what occurred during the instance, use of a decision-making process on what was used to work with the student. Once again, I've said it once, actions of the student before, during, and after the incident, actions of the employees. What did they use to de-escalate or restrain? Along with a debriefing by the employee after the incident. Alternatives to restraint or confinement attempted, if any. An example of that would be if you had a strong behavior supports in place, what was utilized prior to it. If you utilize maybe kind of a recovery room concept where the student, instead of going straight to intervention or restraint, there was something less intrusive provided. They were offered a timeout opportunity. That was in the classroom would be a good example. A description of any injuries if there were to the student or staff, and a description of future approaches to the student's behavior. So this documentation has to be kept, and parents need to be given this documentation along with the school keeping this documentation. Experiences I've had the last 5 years in regards to the state training school, it's really important to keep this information as a school. That's something that can easily be not done. I mean, I get it, but it's something we really need to reconcentrate on and make sure we're doing as part of 103B. The other component of 103B is there needs to be notice to parents annually that 103 is utilized in the school and that there are physical and seclusion strategies utilized in the building. And that can be put in a handbook or something like that. Now remember, I said parents need a copy of that documentation you wrote out for the intervention. They also need to be told on the day of the event. So if you've got a kid that you had in seclusion for an hour and a half and you didn't allow egress out, you got them de-escalated and they finally got back to class, you want to call the parents and tell them this is what came up today. But then you also want to take your documentation that you've written and send that via mail. You know, as a parent, they're going to want to know if their son was in seclusion for 2 hours of the school day. Very important components we need to keep in mind is this whole documentation factor. And the fact, yes,
Can I ask a question?
yeah,
How are they changing the board policies then to match this and meet with?
I would write in the board policy what you're doing. You can write a board policy on restraint and seclusion, and then just kind of write what your process is, Kim. That's a good question. So in your board policy, if you're for, I'll use physical restraint, that you're having staff view the 103B training yearly, and you're providing CPI training to those staff that would be involved in that process.
Would you then also put in the documentation that you're using, like for the timeout room and stuff like that, right in there and connect it with?
In the board policy, I'd just say refer to procedure.
Okay.
Yeah. You could, like you could have, my recommendation is, and this would be a good idea, is you're going to do a documentation form that brings in all the factors. I'll get an example out.
I just built one. So
Did you build one? So if you built one, that can be part of your policy. Yeah. I think that's a good question.
And then is it the same board policy as what you went over at the very beginning of this with the restraint areas?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can all
So
be
then
part.
just add that to it.
Yeah, that can all be
Okay.
part of it.
Thank you.
You know, the other component that was big when 103B was put into place in 2008 was positive behavior interventions and supports. I think we're at a point now where schools really need to be looking, because MTSS with other types of models we're using here at Central Rivers is key to this. You know, our mental health component, which has behavior implementations. So some type of school-wide behavior intervention policy is really good. And I'm going to tell you why. When you're using any type of seclusion as part of a kid's plan, you want to put it in their behavior intervention plan as part of the IEP. This law doesn't state that. This law wasn't written, as just a special ed law in mind, but make sure your behavior intervention plans document your safety plan and document how you're utilizing intervention practices with the student. So that's just my brief overview. Any questions?
Rod,
Yeah.
this is Kim. Are there recommendations on times for kids, like kindergarten or middle school?
Oh, how long they're in seclusion?
Yeah.
No, there isn't. You can write that in a behavior plan, but the real rule is if it goes beyond 60 minutes, you have to have administrator approval to stay in seclusion beyond that 60 minutes. And it may have to, you just have to document that that was considered and all, and done every 60 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Is there guidance on or better description of what debriefing is?
What debriefing is, let me get that. I may have to think that through a little bit, Larry. What debriefing was, I'll use an example when we kind of had our Bremwood program, and Greg's here too, and we had Pinecrest. Debriefing was the staff would get together and discuss what maybe they could have done differently, what actually spurred the behavior in the kid. Do we need to change the behavior plan given this, if it's been kind of a pattern? Do we need to make any other contacts with linkages to help us with this behavior issue at this time if it's a mental health issue? So it can be a wide array of things, Larry. Let me put some stuff together too.
Because from a time frame perspective, you need to communicate that it happened during the day. That debriefing may have not have happened yet.
You're exactly
Staff
right.
don't have time to get together if you're calling them new.
Yeah, usually debriefing in my experience has always occurred after school because that's when you have time.
With the debriefing, if you're doing CPI though, they have a debriefing that you should be doing.
They do.
there.
Yeah, they have that built in.
I don't know if your school district is a CPI school, then that should probably be something that we would use, I would think.
It would, and that's why I also encourage the BIP, it all being written up in the behavior intervention plan too. Because that can be part of the debriefing process if it's an IEP kid. Any other questions? So what I'll do is I'll try to get something on the website in the next month or so in regards to an example of a documentation sheet, maybe a better explanation of debriefing.
One of the things that the directors of special education over the last few years have done is really established good relationships with the parent advocacy groups, Ask Resource Center and Disability Rights of Iowa. And one of the things that we have worked to establish is a good communication system. So if there's an issue in one of the districts here, they will contact me, and now they'll contact Amy if there's an issue. But they also are bringing issues to our attention that they're finding across the state. And one of the issues that they are finding across the state is with 103B and the fact that parents are not being notified. And so Rod talked about the real importance, and for some reason that is an area that we need to really ensure that it continues to happen, is to support parents being notified on the day it occurred, and then also to receive that documentation that Rod talked about. So one of the other areas that they have brought to our attention is with the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act that was passed and implemented, I think, in July 2016. The intent of that act is to ensure that students with disabilities are prepared for competitive employment. And so it prohibits school districts from having contracts with sheltered workshops. And so I'm going to let Rod talk a little bit more about that. And this also was brought to our attention that there are some districts that are still continuing to do that.
Yeah, when WOIA went into effect, the whole intent was that these sheltered workshop entities would become more mainstream, for lack of a better word, but more integrated with their work activities. So they wouldn't have a, quote, work site that was all disabled individuals doing that work anymore. They'd be more out doing work in the general population on general work sites. So as part of that, schools, we're told don't contract with a sheltered workshop that still is not integrated. And I think we need to pay real close attention to that. I know, and I'll use NIVIG as an example. They up in Clear Lake, they have really become very proactive in doing more mainstreaming activities. And kids and those young adults and students are out on work sites in the community as opposed to being in the sheltered environment. A question that'll be asked is going to be, well, if we know that the work setting is going to be out, let's say they've got an enclave that's going out to a nursing home to do laundry, would be an example. Is that okay to contract for that? Sure, as long as it's in the general population as a work site, that would be okay. The thing we want to steer away from is that old model of them working in a sheltered environment with just the disabled employees themselves. So, and I can't really speak to, I don't know if we do much with Mid-Iowa Workshop down in Marshalltown and where that model's at. I know that the ones in Waterloo have become more integrated and are doing more out in the community. So, so from an end, the advice I'd have is you may have dedicated work experience people that are looking for sites for more students with more needs than most special ed kids. So what they need to do is make sure that those are not sheltered setups, that they're more integrated into the community as a work site. And, you know, WIOA, why can't I say that? You know, that was really designed to really help target those work sites, those sheltered sites 2 years ago. And most of those places have made the changes, but there still could be some that haven't quite gotten there yet.
There is a video that has been developed in collaboration with the Ask Resource Center that will be posted on their websites, but it will also be posted on our website, that goes over all the implications and the requirements of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So it will soon be available on our website. All the AEAs will post it on their website. So there'll be more information available about that. One of the other areas that has been brought to our attention is the use of shortened school days. And the concern is students that remain on shortened school day for an extended period of time, and that it may be a denial of faith. And so, Amy, I'm going to turn it over to you, that since you ran Amy, we heard this, a week or a couple weeks ago, and so Amy immediately ran some reports.
Yeah,
So.
I ran our AEA report, so it included all of them. We have 23 kids on shortened school day. The regional administrators have been given that information, and we'll be touching base with all of you on the number of kids that you have and what's going on there. Some real high districts and some that have none. So, but I think that we have to be very careful. That has to be reviewed every 30 days to see if it's still appropriate or not. So it's not a put them on shortened day and forget about it. It's, you know, continue to review that and see how you can integrate them back in, whatever that takes. So you should be getting some information from the regional administrators on that.
Another area that has been brought up as a concern is post-secondary transition services and planning, and it seems hard for me to believe, after all the emphasis we've placed on post-secondary transition services, and yet it continues to be a concern across the state. And that is one of the indicators, and I know that Amy will talk about it at the next quarterly meeting, that is the first indicator that's going to be part of differentiated accountability, is indicator B13. And will 14 also be, or just 13? I can't remember, but.
I don't know.
Yeah, but this is a concern from the standpoint of parents, bringing that to the parent advocacy groups. So just want to reinforce the practices that you have engaged in over the years, that we really need to stay focused on helping students have the skills and the knowledge that they need to transition to adult life. And the critical components of indicator B13, we still need to pay close attention to and ensure that that's being appropriately assessed and then appropriately implemented. So currently, those were the 4 things that were brought to our attention. The 103B and the importance of documentation to parents and notifying parents, the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act, and the effort to help students, all students with disabilities, gain the skills that they need to be competitively employed, and that not automatically assume that they need to be employed through sheltered workshops. The shortened school day, that it's important to review that, and at least on a 30-day basis, and then to continue to plan and provide secondary transition services for students. So those are the things that we wanted to bring to your attention. Another area that has come up, and this was a discussion about being consistent across the state as far as IEPs that only have equipment needs included on it. So for example, there have been in the past some IEPs where students needed classroom amplification. And so if it's a deaf and hard of hearing student that needed classroom amplification, and an IEP might have been written for that 1 year in order to generate funding for the district to purchase the classroom amplification. In trying to get consistency across the state, it really was brought to our attention that students need that a student, in order to be eligible for an individualized education program, a student needs an instructional need. There needs to be a need for specially designed instruction. So there are certainly appropriate situations where equipment is part of that, a part of having the student receive FAPE. If in the event that it's only the equipment, the need for equipment, and not an instructional need, that would not be an appropriate use of weighting an IEP. So we need to make sure that we're evaluating students' needs appropriately and then making decisions based on instructional needs for weighted IEPs. So I know that Amy and I have talked to our audiologists. It seems like it's the audiologists where it may impact the most. And there are very few IEPs that this may, at this point in time, but just want to let everybody know that in order to have an IEP that is weighted level 1, level 2, or level 3, there does need to be an identified instructional need for the student. So in case that comes up, you would have heard it, and our staff, we are talking with our staff also about that. It's important to identify what the instructional need is. So those are the things that we wanted to share with you and give you an update. Are there any questions or comments or issues that you would like to address?
On that last piece about the equipment, is that a change in guidance, and will that be coming out?
Yeah, it's going to be coming out in the school leader update.
Okay.
Yeah.
Previous guidance was that if there's a cost,
right,
an IEP, even if it's support related, it would be weighted.
Right. Yeah. So we have talked about the appropriate way to communicate that, and so the decision was made to have it come out in the school leader update.
Mary, I have a question. You talked about evaluating each student's needs and stuff. Is there guidelines that you need to look at? The reason I'm asking is because mine may look different than Eric's, may look different. Is there a certain protocol that we need to look at or possibly have in mind to making sure that the needs of the students are being met? I know we need to dig deeper into the data and making sure that we're following and finding the holes, but is there some kind of things that we need to look at more than that?
Are you talking about in general or about the equipment? Just in general, because of the AW case. What the guidance is to look at all the information, and actually it's always been in the procedures manual,
right,
that it needs to be the whole picture for the child. So it needs to, really it's going back to review the records, any records that you have on the student, especially being very overt about reviewing outside evaluations to ensure parents understand we're doing it. Not that you haven't been doing it or we haven't been doing it, but it's really important for parents to understand that that's part of the evaluation. The interview data with the parents is critical, as well as with all the providers. Observation of the student in the classroom in different settings, wherever the concern is, and any tasks that the student, and there are times when you would give a test also, but the tasks. So it's really going back to Riot, reviewing and making sure and being very explicit about that. And then taking a look at the instruction, the curriculum, the environment, and then any specific characteristics of the learner. So ISIL and Riot are the two things that we're really stressing. And it's
starting to go back to that now.
yeah, and it's always been there, but what we want to do is really be explicit about it. And you know, the eligibility standards, the evaluation and eligibility standards are very thorough, and it would really be helpful for people. And we're going to have our staff go through those standards because they will provide the overall picture as well as some specifics about. And the standards you can find on the DE website.
Where are they?
They're under evaluation, and it's they're listed. I just showed
On the DE website?
the DE website. They have them, and they're 10 eligibility standards. There's also an online course that you can take to review them.
I'm sorry, what was that?
There's also an online course that you can
On the
take.
AEA online?
Yeah,
Okay.
that they're modules for each one of the standards that you go through and review it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you for the next, if there aren't any other questions.
We've set up the next two meetings, February 5th, and we'll be in the Iowa River Room, which is a glass room out here because there aren't any other rooms available. And then at 9, and then April 9th, we will have it, and that will be in this is A2, right, or is this A1? This is A2. We'll be back in this room then on April 9th at 9. So thank you all for coming. If you have any questions, I've got Mary's cell phone number, so I'll feel confident in answering for a while yet until I've asked her not to change her number until I retire. So hopefully she'll do that. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks.